Welcome. Let me know. Now 7:05.
It's live now.
Okay. Freedom Friday, July 23rd, 2021. Welcome to another Freedom Friday, folks. Another Freedom Friday forum presented by the Woodson Banneker Jackson Bay Division330 UNIA ACL RC2020. My name is Baba Musi Maximila, President of the UNIA Division330, and I'm here with Baba Congo Africa, Vice President of Division330 UNIA, and a more than 30 years member of the UNIA, I might add. And we have as well a distinguished panel of presenters who are highly qualified to speak on what is our subject, and that is the Africans of Cuba and their relations with continental Africa. That, of course, was the chosen subject when the forum was decided on prior to the recent issue of demonstrative dissension in Cuba. We will stick to the subject matter, but no one should be surprised if a variance ensues, since we are talking of Cuba. But first, let's do some house cleaning. For those who are unaware, we are an African organization in the universal sense. The UNIA was created to serve the interests of African people in every part of the world. Marcus Garvey in his travels had found that Black people, African people, were unrepresented in governance and commerce wherever he went, and he decided to do something about it. In short, he, with Amy Ashwood, organized and founded the UNIA in Jamaica in 1914, and later in the United States, where the largest Black organization bloomed to give African descendants, Africans, Black people, the pride and hope of future development not seen before or after. Okay, so the organization has its own constitution, the preamble of which I will recite as our opening ritual to this forum. And let me recite it. Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League is a social, friendly, humanitarian, charitable, educational, institutional, constructive, and expansive society, and is founded by persons desiring to the utmost to work for the general uplift of the Negro peoples of the world. And the members pledge themselves to do all in their power to conserve the rights of their noble race and to respect the rights of all mankind, believing always in the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. The motto of the organization is one God, one aim, one destiny. Therefore, let justice be done to all mankind. To all mankind, realizing that if the strong oppresses the weak, confusion and discontent will ever mark the path of man, but with love, faith, and charity towards all, the reign of peace and plenty will be heralded into the world, and the generations of men shall be called blessed. And from that, we shall move on, because, you know, as an African organization created to unite Africans for self-reliance, self-determination, and redemption, malaise of capitalists and white racial supremacy.
I'm going to give you a shot. What you say is everybody I can, and the easy ones twice.
Yeah, I like that.
Would you, whoever that is, could you mute yourself? Thank you. Okay. All right. So this is going to be try to be an open discussion because everyone here has I would say a level of knowledge of Cuba and Africa that we can have a discussion wherein we will all benefit, wherein we will all be on the same level playing field. Not that it's some kind of game or rivalry, some kind of academic discussion too strongly, but we want African people here in the United States and everywhere else who may view this or who are viewing it now to understand what it is that Cuba is. They may not know, as a matter of fact, there are very few people who are not in what we would call a progressive area, progressive field, who can discuss certain things about Cuba. Most people are distracted, let's put it that way. Most, and I'm saying mainly Black people. And so we want to bring some idea of what Africans in Cuba are like, what the history of it is prior to the revolution, and what has ensued post-revolutionary. Oh, it's great. Okay. Yes. I guess some people are not getting in, and that I can't mute myself while that's happening. Okay. As I was saying, we want to inform Black people. We want to inform folks that Cuba is close to being an African nation, if we look at it in the sense of the United States and how we see Black people as the one-drop method or something, whatever that is. We know they don't think the same way, but that is how we see it. We want them to understand that what is happening in Cuba today with this blockade, that African people are suffering. We want to wake up African people to the fact that Cuban people are being affected by this blockade, and our relationship with them should be at a different level than it is right now. And we should wake up, because the authorities here in the United States are using us to continue with their blockade, because most of us are silent or asleep. Well, I will leave that for the presenters to bring forward their ideas or what may be their opinions of what I have just said, as well as what they know as being the truth. So I was going to start with Dr. Horn because of the historical aspect, and he was only going to be in for the first hour. So what I will do now is turn this over to Brother James Early, who's going to give us the early opinion. Brother James, what do you say? You're muted.
Thank you. This is an unexpected assignment, particularly in the absence of the extraordinary, I think one of the most important intellectuals on the globe today, Dr. Gerald Horn. who I will certainly pale in comparison to. This is a very timely discussion because the issue of race and Africanity in Cuban culture and in Cuban self-identity is very evident in contemporary discussions. But of course, for the moment, we want to step back and take a historical look and a context to see how this has evolved over the period from the enslavement of the minds and the bodies of Africans from diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds on the continent of Africa, who were key to the development of the so-called New World. And of course, the so-called New World was the development of a maturing capitalism in which, notwithstanding the fact that indigenous communities were the first to be enslaved in that process, it is indeed the African knowledge and African minds and labor that really made the difference in the development of colonialism, in the development of the new republics, when those Europeans then began to fight against their mother country such that they could control their own destiny. And this issue of Africa and its various expressions in the Americas continues till today. Cuba is one of the prime examples of that on many fronts, starting with the cultural knowledge of self that the many different enslaved Africans brought with them. This is manifest in the fact that the Communist Party of Cuba, at least 2.5, perhaps 3 decades ago, gave a report that the most important religion or religious expressions in the Cuban nations are derived from these African cultures, not from Catholicism. The power of those cosmologies, of those worldviews, of those practices and their multiple expressions are not just coded in the color of the skin, although that is a significant attribute. It is in the socialization of all Cubans, such that Africanía en la cultura cubana, Africanisms in Cuban culture, is a long historically researched and documented process by some of the most outstanding scholars in the history of Cuba. I'm sorry that I had not done my homework earlier. I'm holding up a book here called Los que Volvieron by Rudolf Saracino, which was written in 1988. Los que Volvieron a Africa, those that returned to Africa, dates how Africans from various ethnic and cultural backgrounds always knew where they came from. And they were always there in the cultural expressions within Cuba and the building of the Cuban nation. But many of them also escaped and are found other modes to go back to Africa, such that you can trace their names in certain countries and phone books. There is also an analog of those that returned from Brazil, a book of the same title, showing this particularly with regard to Nigeria and the area of Benin of Yoruba culture. So this is a historical context of African expressions. Now, there is historically a debate in Cuba. Cuba is a very nationalistic country, perhaps one of its strongest ideological and political attributes, since it defeated Spanish colonialism, a very proud people. And the notion that todos nosotros somos cubanos, we are all Cuban. Some Cubans take the perspective that they don't make distinctions between racial identity. I once had the wife of an Cuban ambassador here in Washington, D.C. call me up on the weekend to say that, James, I heard you on the radio using the term Afro-Cuba. We don't use that term in Cuba. I politely said to her, Afro-Cuba de Matanzas, Afro-Cuba of Matanzas is one of the renowned cultural groups. I could go through a whole list of expressions. So there has been this issue of national identity and the relationship to ethnic and racial identity in relationship to participation as full citizens pre and post the revolution. And this sets a context even to look at today's events. So Africa is very strong in Cuban socialization, notwithstanding whatever the skin color, the color of eyes, the color of skin. It is a socialized cultural proposition. And they realize across the country that they are connected to Africa in the deepest ways. And in that context, There are the debates about terminology and what are the policy implications. And at another point, perhaps we can speak of some of the more contemporary expressions going on in Cuba today. Let me leave that as my unexpected attempt at setting some historical backdrop.
Well, I think you did pretty good, my brother. I think that was excellent as an introductory. And you know, you know, we have some time here, you know, what you may feel that you failed to mention later on as we discuss, you will always have that opportunity to come back. So there's, you know, you haven't failed to do your job there. So you've done very good. Okay. All right. Now, what, you know, that's a good introduction. And it leads us right into the present day situation. Or let's say it leads us into where should we be at this moment in thinking of what has happened after the revolution. Should we think that Africans should be more involved in the socioeconomic space in Cuba, or are they doing much better than they did before? Are they doing less? How African are they today than they were prior to the revolution? I will, Bamboshe, can I turn to you to bring up your opinion? You're muted? Oh no, okay.
That's really setting a framework there, my brother. I would like to say
Express
that
yourself, my brother. This is all we need. Your expression of, I mean, you're a Cuban.
no problem.
I know that. So let's express yourself.
I'd like to say that, of course, Africans in Cuba are Africans. We have no doubt of that. We think that when we look at the history of Cuba, the Africans were brought in to replace a group of people who could. So we have to look at this. History started with the Tanos, who was a branch of the Arawak Indians that you find all over the Caribbean. I know they're in Jamaica, they're probably in Guyana too, even though you have much more Indians than we do in Jamaica. The Sibonje, which is another group of Indians, which were probably the first group to practically face that genocide. And if you go to Cuba today, up in the mountains, you will still find communities of Indians who the government as particularly gave whatever necessities they need to ensure that they continue as a people. And to some extent, it's even part of the history in Cuba. So we're not the first people in Cuba, but we were not even the first people in Cuba to be enslaved. But like Africans everywhere, we were brought to Cuba to be slaves, to work the sugar plantations, etc. And it soon became evident to everybody that this enslavement, if you will, was not something that the Africans in Cuba or anywhere else felt sustainable. And the Africans in Cuba, like everywhere else, had intercommunications with Africans in the other islands, and Africans in the United States, to the point that they were consciously aware of when the French fled Haiti and came into Cuba, why they were fleeing. They were consciously aware of the role of people inside the United States. I think that the great bronze titan, Antonio Maceo, had meetings and correspondence with Frederick Douglass. So there was these kind of interactions. Of course, later, there were even more interaction. But we must understand that also the Africans made up the foundation of the War of Independence in Cuba. And the War of Independence against Spanish colonialism produced Antonio Maceo. And out of that came an awareness that, if I could just quote something that Maceo said, if I can find it, he said that when Cuba is free and as a constitutional government, I shall request that we fight for the independence of Puerto Rico. Also, I would not care to put up my sword, leaving of America in East Clear. Now, as the Cuban Party for Independence, the Cuban Army for Independence, was about to complete their victory against the Spaniards, the US came in and snatched that victory out of their arms, invading Cuba under pretext of a Spanish sinking of a ship, the Maine, and occupied Cuba for different periods of time, 3 years, 6 years, 4 years. And during this invasion, the first invasion, they were able to garnish Guantanamo Bay, which they still occupy today, and which Cuba wants back because it's an illegal occupation of their territory. So when you look at all of that, you begin to see the role that Africans were playing inside of the Cuban society. Coming on up, you do realize, I'm sure, that the largest chapter of the UNIA in the Caribbean was in Cuba, and particularly in a little town called Baines, which was a United Fruit Company enclave. It was where workers from throughout the Caribbean came to Cuba, especially to Eastern Cuba and to Santiago de Cuba, etc. And Baines is just north of Santiago on the north coast of the island. It was also the home of Fidel Castro. That's where he grew up as a baby. So he went to school. I went to his classrooms, I know. But this organizing of workers by the UNIA was a sign that in that movement, in the UNIA, there was a clear understanding of what workers felt they needed. Otherwise, they could not have organized them. I think that if you move on, there was different periods in Cuban history where people who at one point was progressive became reactionary, and people who were at one point reactionary became progressive. I think when you look at Bethesda, who pulled the coup to begin with, once he was elected, he began working with the Cuban Communist Party at that time. He did a number of progressive things, but then he reverted back because of pressure from, you guess, the United States to put more control and to ensure that Cuba remained the playground for the rich. And at that time, it was the rich who went to Cuba to procure prostitution. It was also the mafia who controlled the hotels, etc. in Cuba, based from America, Linsky, the Jewish mafia. So all of those situations was occurring, and the effect that they had on the African people at that time was a pressure that mounted, a pressure that saw the need for a new society, a change in society. Thus, by 1959, of us flocked to the revolution. So I think that when you're looking at Cuba's history, Brother James gave the historical perspective. But on the line in that historical perspective is these nuances that we must also look at.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Brother Bamboshi, for your interesting presentation there. That of course has taken us up to the point of the revolution, and I think what I would like us to get into now is the part that Africans played in the evolving of this revolution, the consummation of it, and the victory. So, of the revolution. So, I will, if it's okay with you, I will now move on to someone who is a friend of Cuba, who has some connections with African and Cuban Friendship Association, I think. But Brother Obi, you can correct me. Who you know, can give us some of his opinions of what has happened, the revolution, the connections it has had with Africa.
Okay. Good. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Good evening. I'm glad to be here. You're correct. And first of all, I'm honored to be here on behalf of the Get Out of Cuba Way movement and campaign, and on behalf of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. I'm honored to be here because anytime the UNIA extends an invitation to you for Cuba, it's an honor, because as Brother Bamboshi said, you had 40 branches in Cuba at one point. And I'm honored to be on, in particular, with Brother Bamboshi, because 26 years ago, when I was part of a youth organization in the city called the Pan-African Student Youth Movement, he introduced us to a Spanish-speaking African diplomat in Cuba named Jose Ponce Carabello, who ended up being deported from the United States under false charges of espionage. So that started my involvement through different organizational vehicles, but that was the first encounter with Cuba. And all through the different work we've done, he has advised and encouraged us. So I'm eternally grateful to him. I'm the External Relations Officer of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association, so I can begin there. If you know anything about Zimbabwe, you know that they are the only non-Soviet, ZANU-PF is the only non-Soviet backed liberation movement in Southern Africa to win its independence through armed struggle. SWAPO in Namibia was Soviet supported. MPLA in Angola was Soviet supported. FRELIMO in Mozambique was Soviet supported. Even though they did not win their independence through armed struggle, but through negotiations, the African National Congress was also part of that Soviet bloc. So in 1985, 5 years after Zimbabwe's independence, the then prime minister who became president, the revolutionary Pan-African icon,
The sound go. Sound, I guess it's a Wi-Fi issue.
Yeah, Ovi, can you repeat
had
that?
that honor.
We couldn't hear you.
You lost me? Oh, okay.
About
1 year, President Mugabe got that award 1 year after Thomas Sankara got it in Burkina Faso. And of course, Madiba Nelson Mandela had that honor bestowed on him in 1990. So the reason that Zimbabwe has a 97% literacy rate today is because between 1986 and 1996, 3,000 Zimbabwean teachers went to Cuba to the island of youth for training. And they are the staple and the pillar behind the educational system in Zimbabwe, which is equally as important as celebrating Cuba's shoulder-to-shoulder arm solidarity with us in Angola, their willingness to fight in Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and the Congo. So just in relationship to Zimbabwe, of course, Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah is the first head of state, period, to acknowledge the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Gamal Abdel Nasser doing it on his heels. Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria defied John F. Kennedy when he came here after the Algerian Revolution prevailed. Kennedy asked him to cancel his trip to Cuba because that was next on the tour. Not only did he ignore Kennedy, but he went and prepared a speech in Spanish. The very first place in Africa that Comandante Fidel Castro touched was Guinea. And so far, based on what we know, the only other person besides Jose Marti that he called a revolutionary apostle was Ahmed Sekou Touré, the leader of the Guinean Revolution and co-founder of the Democratic Party of Guinea. So as we go through, I mean, the ties are endless, but if it was what I wanted to do today was to talk about the practical aspect, the labor and the service. I was leaving it to the others to deal with the history, but of course you can't avoid it.
Yeah.
So since I saw you but I hope for a beginning, that is enough. And of course, we watched in the 1990s how different people who influenced us always made sure that we addressed the issue of Cuba in whatever context we could. As a follow-up to the Million Man March, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan had a World Friendship Tour. One of the first stops he made was to Cuba. On the 1 year anniversary of the Million Man March, in the 2 minutes afforded to Kwame Touré, he used all 2 of those minutes to talk about lifting the blockade of Cuba at the United Nations. Of course, Brother Kwame went to Cuba on behalf of SNCC and the Organization of Latin American Solidarity, where young Fidel Castro talked about retribution if 1 grain of his head was touched. So we did a press conference 3 weeks ago for the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations, darker than anyone on this panel tonight, true African, Spanish-speaking African. So all these questions about African empowerment in Cuba, yet they make their face at the United Nations, who is their face to the world, He's an African, who prior to that was in Geneva. And the reason that we did that press conference, because it was on the heels of the victory of the vote, where 184 nations voted against the blockade. And 2 nations, of course, voted in favor of it.
Audio again, Bobby. Yeah.
Prensa Latina, the national media outlet in Cuba. So that was the objective of that press conference. Since we last saw you, we created an appeal. When the corona pandemic hit, since it hit, we have seen the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade, who Comandante Fidel Castro called their greatest army, at today are functioning. They are 57 brigades in 40 nations. And we want to know why the United States cannot be one of those nations. So since last year, we did an appeal in the tradition of David Walker's appeal, in the tradition of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey's appeal to the League of Nations in 1923, in the tradition of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois' appeal in 1947, in the tradition of Brother Malcolm's appeal to the UN that he was getting started, but of course the New York Police Department, FBI, and CIA had other ideas. So we did an appeal as a working tribute to them, calling for Cuban medical personnel to come to this country. Since we last saw you, we understand the power of art in this equation. And 7 years ago, working in conjunction with one of the most militant hip hop groups that hip hop as a genre has ever produced, Dead Prez, one of their artists, Mutulu Olubala, and I embarked on a project called The Battle Cry for Cuba and Zimbabwe, where between 2014 and 2017, 3 albums of music were produced, over 100 songs of music, multi-genre, cross-generational. But to follow up on that, and since we saw you last, in July of last year, and in February of this year, we organized 2 cultural artistic tributes to Cuba. Through that process, 10 artists representing 10 African nations participated, 7 Caribbean nations, 17 United States cities, and 5 European Union countries. According to the Cuban diplomats, that was the first time in history that a cultural tribute on that level was done celebrating them. And this is also on the heels of us, through the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, writing the first children's play outside of Cuba in connection to the Cuban doctors. To follow up on that, last year, 2 21-year-olds, then 20, and a 16-year-old girl named Sia Lee Wright, Zion Utsi, and Jalen Mitchell, they did a mini documentary calling for the Cuban medical personnel to come inside of United States borders. And the mini documentary, for those of you who've seen it, is 8 minutes and 32 seconds, which means that in less time than it took terrorist police in Minnesota to snuff the life of George Floyd, our babies made a documentary reaffirming our commitment to the Cuban Revolution and the African Revolution, because the two are inseparable. The work and service is what drives us. And at this moment, while there was a meeting last week that we were in with Mr. Early, where there were some concerned veteran solidarity workers concerned about the recent developments in Cuba, they talked about what steps needed to be taken next. And our position was very clear. We will never overreact to the regime change agenda of the Biden administration, just like we did not overreact to Trump's regime change overtures or Obama's regime change overtures, and every president that has been at the helm of the White House since we've been doing this work. We would remain on the offensive. But what we have come up with is a call, and it is a call for redemption, restitution, and repair for the Cuban people in defense of their homeland and sovereignty. You may ask why that particular language, why that particular verbiage? Simple. We are 20 years removed from the United Nations Conference on Racism, Xenophobia, and Other Related Intolerances. And one of the main things that inspired everybody there was when Comandante Fidel Castro not only said he supports reparations for Africans as part and parcel of Cuba paying their debt to Africa for colonialism, settler colonialism, and physical activity, but he let it be known that Cuba would physically begin to actively pursue reparations for the damages that the blockade has caused since it was imposed in 1962. So we are calling on all the organizations in our community throughout the diaspora, throughout Africa, to sign on to this document that we have. We will present it to you after this. One of the other crucial things is when we come to deal with the Cuba question, we have gone from solidarity to camaraderie. It is not, we don't believe that we're in solidarity with Cuba, because if we say that the experience in the diaspora is an extension of our experience, and we reject the amputated narrative of the collective African experience that seeks to cut us off, cut off Africans in the US from Africans in the rest of the Americas, cut off Africans in the Americas from Africans in Europe, then we refuse to say moving forward in the spirit of revolution that we're in solidarity with them, because with all due respect, based on what they've done for Africa in relationship to medicine, education, armed struggle, diplomatic solidarity, it would make a mockery of those noble gestures just to say that we're in solidarity with them. So, and as follow-up to our push for their medical personnel to come inside United States borders, in September, on Osaje for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's birthday, we are calling for Africans in the diaspora to create a resource pool for their work on the African continent. They have 4,000 medical personnel dispersed throughout Africa, who, when they are not treating our ill, are training the future aspiring doctors of African nations who have decided that they will remain in their countries and will not come to France, will not come to Australia, will not come to Paris, will not come to London, will not come to New York, will not come to Los Angeles. Their skills stay in Burkina Faso, stay in Uganda, stay in Nigeria, stay in Ethiopia, stay everywhere that the Cubans are training them to remain. So we are saying that the time has come to give our people an alternative to the United States Agency for International Development, the Bush Foundation, the Obama Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, Doctors Without Borders, all of those entities that have used humanitarian aid as a weapon of bribery against African people. At a moment where of the 784 million people on the planet that live on $1.90 a day or less, 400 million of them are in Africa. At a moment in history where non-communicable diseases have emerged as the #1 killer of the human being. But at the same time, things come full circle. So we have had people in the past who are considered progressive, who are considered iconic. So the fact that Zionist Israel was the only other nation to support the blockade being maintained shows you that Israel, in the spirit of when they came out against, they failed to recognize Tunisia's self-determination at the UN, Algeria's self-determination at the UN, openly supported apartheid in what's called South Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Zimbabwe, in Namibia, who was colonized by the Germans, ironically. This is an opportunity for us to call on those who have been friendly to Israel, who have been favorable to Israel in our community, but at the same time have been friendly to Cuba. We have to ask them the question, who do they choose? To stand with Zionist Israel or to stand with Cuba? In particular, we need to have that conversation with Mr. Harry Belafonte, because we know that he popularized the song Hava Nagila, which is a celebration of the Balfour Declaration, which was the diplomatic exercise that brought Zionist Israel into existence. But we know that the Cuban people, the Cuban Revolution, consider him a friend. And we know in his memoirs, he attacked Kwame Ture, he attacked Sekou Toure, and he attacked Miriam Makeba. And they are no longer here to defend themselves, but with that being said, we know what Kwame Toure's position would have been on Israel voting in favor of the blockade. You know what Ahmed Sekou Touré's position would have been, because Guinea was very pivotal in pushing the resolution at the UN 3379, Zionism is racism, Zionism is colonialism. And we know where Miriam Makeba stood. So we think that it is very important for the sympathizers to Zionism in our community to now come out and condemn them for voting in favor of this blockade. And for those of us who spend time engaging at the African Union in a diplomatic capacity, whatever it is, we must ask the African Union to strip Israel of its observer status. Not only for previous crimes, but this criminal act of voting in favor of the blockade on Cuba. So in closing, we say that Cuba is, to make an analogy of main roads and feeder roads, side streets, as we say in the United States, Cuba helps us deal with other issues. For example, at a time where people discuss Brother Malcolm's assassination like an Alfred Hitchcock show or Agatha Christie novel, Cuba shows you how to persevere, where the 635 assassination attempts on Comandante Fidel Castro's life came up blank. They give reparations an expanded narrative and dimension. Their work in education continues, and their health brigades in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America are second to none. Whether you want to highlight Operation Project Miracle in conjunction with Venezuela, whether you want to highlight the work they did to eradicate Ebola in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia 6 years ago, or whether you want to look at the offer that Comandante Fidel Castro made to Kofi Annan 21 years ago, that if the resources were ever available, Cuba would deploy 4,000 HIV/AIDS specialists to the African continent who would remain there until HIV/AIDS was eradicated. So as the conversation continues, we'll throw in certain aspects of historical relevance, but it was no way that we were coming here to discuss historical relevance, historical context in isolation from practical service, right this minute, right this second. That's it.
Thank you, my brother. I did not expect anything less. And this is pretty good in the sense of where we're going to segue, because you know, what I wanted to get into with you was how much of Africa or Africans in Cuba or Afro-Cubans are being projected when we see them going to Africa and elsewhere with these medical missions, etc. But I'll hold off on that until we'll come back to that. Okay.
Right.
I want to come to a point now where you've all covered a little bit prior to revolution, during revolution, and now we want to come to this point where today, what is happening? How are Africans responding to what's going on present day? And I'm going to drop this right into the lap of my good sister, Esther, because she has, you know, I've heard her making comments, and she has done some traveling. She has done a lot of, you know, I guess critiques of situations in Cuba today. And I would like to hear her present what she thinks is happening in Cuba today and how are Africans involved. You're muted, sister.
No, I know. I was just, and I have to
I
apologize.
just threw you in a deep hole.
Probably.
I hope I didn't throw you in a deep hole that you have to climb.
Oh no, it's no problem. I have to apologize because I realize I'm going to have to switch at some point to have some better lighting, but I didn't want to disrupt the flow. I didn't know when you would come to me, and then I wouldn't be prepared. So,
Okay.
well, I want to. I was trying to make some notes because I wanted to figure out what I could, present as a cohesive presentation as opposed to just answering questions. But I want to say that it might be easy to kind of start with what's happening right now in terms of the protests on the island. That might be a good way to get into it. So from what I've been able to understand from looking at the coverage of the protests, I think it's really important to know that how the social media campaigns have basically manipulated the situation about race in Cuba to sow a lot of confusion among people, even among people in Cuba. The information that we have is that this is a very sophisticated social media campaign coming from a Latin American, Argentinian, Agustin Antonetti. And he's been involved in these same types of disinformation campaigns involving Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, even Brazil in terms of the election there where, Lula was arrested. And in other words, to really kind of destabilize any efforts on the left to organize in Latin America. And some of these same tactics have been used in Cuba. And one of the interesting things in Cuba is that they were able to utilize young Black people in Cuba. The National Endowment for Democracy has funded hip hop as a way of, they do their kind of cultural outreach, and they use culture, and actually know some people like young poets who were basically really proud that they got these, like, I guess, gigs with, I don't know, the State Department or something, because, as an artist to have like kind of a regular steady check like that is really awesome. But the thing is that they're using culture in this situation to fund artists who wouldn't necessarily have any other steady income like that, especially that type of money, where you're talking about maybe tens of thousands of dollars or even maybe in the six figures for an artist in Cuba. So it's sad that the kind of theme song that has been kind of promoted as spurring on this like movement has coming from like a Black hip hop group where they're basically denouncing the Cuban Revolution. And the thing about it though is that it doesn't come out of a total vacuum, in the sense that even though the Cuban Revolution made kind of, racism illegal, right? They wanted to eradicate the vestiges of the colonial period and periods of slavery, and the racism that exists in Cuba, just like any place else in Latin America, where you had this hierarchy of the enslaved and then the colored, the mulattoes, and how people were kind of segregated by race and even color within the society. But the revolution made it, they recognized that race was a way of dividing the Cuban people. They they did not want to recognize that racism, you couldn't just eradicate it that way. You couldn't just teach it away. Just like we found in this country in the 60s, even though there were certain new laws put in place, the same hierarchy and the same legacies of racism still exist here. So even more so in a place like Cuba. So I guess my point is that the NED, which is like a CIA cutout, was able to really utilize the vestiges of racism that still exist in Cuba. So that's just one part of kind of talking about what's happening right now. The other thing is that there was a man who, from Cuba, Cuban American, Felix, who came to the rally outside of the Cuban embassy the other day. And he talked about how Afro-Cubans were particularly targeted with a lot of this social media misinformation, because they would show pictures from Colombia, for example, of Black people have been slaughtered in the streets in Colombia, participating in a general strike, participating in a general uprising there. And so pictures will be shown there as if these were Cuban soldiers or forces brutalizing and killing Black people in Cuba, right? There was another story sent out that there was a ship of food and medicine off the coast of Cuba that was there waiting for Cubans, but the Cuban government would not accept it. And this is what's being told to people who are starving, who don't have enough food. So I just wanted to mention a little bit about the current right now. Now, the rest I want to talk about is in the reference to like my trips to Cuba. And I've been there, I guess 3 or 4 times. And the first time I went to Cuba, I spent most of my time in Santiago de Cuba, which was a great place to be because it was more the Black part of Cuba. And for example, when I was there, the majority of the people graduating from the medical school in Santiago de Cuba were Black. And so this was a way for me to see the place and the presence of Black people in Cuba, their ability to get an education, their ability to thrive in the society, whereas before they were not able to survive in that way. They weren't able to get an education. They had just discrimination in all parts of society, just like we do here. The other thing that was in Santiago was a real embrace of African-derived culture. So I was there for something called the Feast of Fire. And so just like here, there are people who recognize the Yoruba spirits, like Shango and Oya. These are the kinds of things being lifted up, at the festival in terms of visual art, in terms of dance, in terms of a lot of the presentations that we could go to, and also the music and the African drumming and the ways that people were made it very clear that in terms of the history from Antonio Maceo to the present, that Africa and African culture was very much a part of Cuba. And then when I went to Havana, it was a little bit different. And the first trip was in the late 90s. And I understand now that I'm able to put it into a certain historical context, whereas maybe before I wasn't. So in Havana, I was very much aware that the tourism industry that Cuba had to rely on after the collapse of the Soviet Union was having a tremendous impact on how they could bring their revolution to fruition and to kind of keep it growing. Because before the revolution, for example, the role of women and Black women in particular was very debased in Cuba. Cuba was thought of as basically as a brothel, as a casino and a whorehouse, for not only tourists, but, for, like regional, like sailors coming there through the ports. I even read how in slavery, for example, when the other crops weren't doing so well, or there was some type of, problem with the farming aspect of plantations, they would send out women to be prostitutes, basically. So that would be the way for the slave masters to continue to make money by selling the bodies of women and girls as part of enslavement. So during a lot of that was eradicated during the early decades of the revolution. But by the 90s, by the time that I got there to make my first trip there during this special period, a lot of those aspects of prostitution had started to resurface. And a lot of the aspects of racism had started to resurface also, because some of the European companies that set up hotels and were able to kind of work in tourism, I noticed that they would mainly hire like light-skinned Cubans. So some of the former advantages that lighter or white Cubans had were more manifested in this period when the Cuban Revolution was perhaps, kind of interrupted. There was this special period when they weren't able to have the support of the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and on the ground, that meant a lot of the old pre-revolutionary aspects of society came to fore. So not only did I see that there were mainly white or light-skinned people hired in the tourism industry, but they had more access to, funds coming from their families in Miami. I had a few unfortunate situations where it was assumed that just because I was in a hotel as a Black woman in Havana, that I must be a prostitute. And there was one bad situation because of my partner at the time, very hot tempered, was really almost basically hurt this white man who wanted to approach me like I was a prostitute and I was available. So I could see there was a difference between what I experienced in Santiago, more of a Black area of Cuba, where at the particular festival I was at, Black culture was being celebrated, and coming to Havana, where there was more of a tourism aspect, where you could see the kind of more of the manifestations of the impact of white European companies that were still dealing with Cuba, mainly, I think, probably Canada, but also European countries dealing with Cuba. So that was one trip. And I think the same things I experienced maybe on other trips. I was able to go to Cuba as part of a brigade, and this was more of a political trip. And that was really great because I got a chance to really interact with more people in Cuba on a political level. And that was right before the pandemic. So I was part of a work brigade, and we started to really understand some of the impacts right now in Cuba because of the blockade, because of the increased sanctions under the Trump administration. And the last trip was for the anti-imperialist conference. And gosh, I'm trying to remember, I think it was 2018. So that was also a political trip. And so I was able to meet people from around the world who had come there to have solidarity with Cuba, to speak out on the broader global anti-imperialist movement. And so having that experience, I really understand, kind of what is happening now. I understand the connection between Cuba being a part of this global anti-imperialist movement and the desire of the United States to further marginalize, attack Cuba, to try to have regime change, to have to disrupt and try to destabilize the country. And so anyway, I hope that serves for a good opening comments, and I'm going to switch over to some better lighting. And so, but I will hear you, but I'm here.
Okay. All right.
Great job.
Thank you, my sister, for sharing your experience and perspective on Cuba, especially this being a forum concentrating on what is the matter of racism anywhere in the world. We care about our people and on what is happening to them in the sense of the social economic area. Yes, I have had an experience where in Cuba, whereby I had discussions with some Cuban retirees, ex-officials, and so on. And one thing that you mentioned about sister, about the Miami people coming into Cuba and investing in restaurants and other entertainment centers and business in general. I had noticed that from, you know, most of the restaurants that I went to, they were managed by what may be white or near white Cubans, and you had a few here and there who had Africans working with them. And I brought that up, and I also brought up to the group that I think it's a mistake to open up Cuba too much at this point in time and having so many people coming in. I know they were desperate, and I knew they needed to have that foreign exchange and all that. But these people were, they were very confident. I'm saying, oh, maybe overly so, that none of what was coming into Cuba at that time would affect the Cuban race relations or the relations of the economy going in another direction other than in a socialist type economy. So that brings me to the point where I would over to Robert Congo. He may have some questions, and then I'll come back and I'll start with you, Brother James.
I have some observation. In 1804, when the Haitians fought and got their freedom, France put an embargo that bankrupted the country and stayed bankrupt. Cuba's gone through 50 years, but you know, Haiti has gone through a whole lot more. Because of the same reason, all the European countries observed that embargo and plus forced Haiti to pay so much for freeing themselves from slavery. Something that some people don't know is we got some billionaires going up into space. But the first black person to go up in space was a Cuban. Most Americans don't know that because they're not taught that in school, you know. We talk about the one day of demonstration that took place in Cuba, but for the last 3 months, there have been nationwide strike in Colombia. But Marco Rubio and everybody else don't talk about that and don't support, you know, don't support the people who are demonstrating against whatever's going on in that country. A country I found it was interesting that Santo Domingo, Haiti, and Cuba have about the same amount of population, 12 million people, approximately. Only one of them have very high literacy rate. And that's, you know, I find it's in this day and age, I don't know why CARICOM and the OAS won't let Cuba in like they don't exist. I mean, and to me, like you have to just stand up and like, hey, CARICOM, you know, Cuba's part of the Caribbean. Anyway, that's, you know, one of the greatest things that Cuba has is like one for every 1,000 people is a doctor, and they've done a whole lot of good job. And it's bad when you have a very robust research that Cuba has developed all kinds of medicines for quite a few different things. And they've come up with 3 different vaccines just for this pandemic that's going around the world. But can't buy the syringes because they can't pay for the syringes that they buy from another country to any banking system because of what this country would do to that bank, either fine them or bar them from doing things. And you know, and what we're doing is a practice of, so it's not my word, but one of my friends call it this starvation diplomacy. That's hurting my people. It's really hurting my people. You know, sometimes people wonder why there's support from Black people. Is that the right-wing governments of all of Latin America are very, very bad for Black people. And the right-wing government for this country is very, very bad for Black people. You know, so, I mean, they practice, you know, racism and white supremacy up to the hilt. That's just my little observation. You know, and the unfortunate thing that I find that this is someone pointed out to me again, is that most of the Western countries, we really almost are treated like sharecroppers. If you know how a sharecropper works, you know, you do all this work, you reap all this thing, and then you know, your so-called boss will tell you like, hey, this is what you're gonna get paid, and if you don't like it, get off my land. You know, it's just another part. It's just another form of slavery. You know, but anyway, that's just some observation. I mean, there's a whole lot more facts I can go through about what Cuba has done. But I mean, to fighting illiteracy and being up there high, very high, or maybe even the highest in the Western Hemisphere for literacy, that's a fantastic. You know, so you have literacy and health. They just need jobs. And then they won't, I mean, well, they can't create jobs if you can't do any bank transaction outside your country. I mean, and these people just, you know, I mean, even when sometimes when you pay for something, like Venezuela paid for some vaccine, it won't get delivered because of the stupid economic embargo. I mean, that's stupid. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Okay, Bob. You know, Brother James, I'm going to bring you forward. From all that we've discussed, I leave it up to you to choose that area in which you would like to make further comment from all what we've discussed here earlier. If you like.
Okay. I want to make several observations. I've been traveling to Cuba for about 45 years. I don't know, people ask me how many times I've been there, maybe 75, maybe 100 times. I spent a lot of time on the ground across the country with everyday ordinary Cuban citizens, and particularly doing my professional work through the Smithsonian with regard to grassroots community cultures. I spent a lot of time with members of the Communist Party, meeting with members of the Communist Party on virtually every trip that I've made at the Communist Party headquarters. I have spent time with the current president when he was Vice President Diaz-Canel Bermudez for about 3 hours talking about the issues of race. And then 2 years ago, I spent about 2.5 hours with him as president. I spent time with Fidel Castro at his home, not so incidentally, with Harry Belafonte, which is filmed, in which I asked him about the question of race. And he said to me, and this was all he said, you should speak to Chavez about that. Recalling that Hugo Chavez said that he was a mestizo, basically of Spanish and Indian background, but that his grandmother was Black. And within 3 months of that conversation, in 2003, I think it was, when I was there with the Trans-Africa Forum, when we met with President Chavez, he was talking about his curly hair and his big lips as a reflection of Mother Africa. So these issues of terminology and changes of consciousness are very important. From the vantage point of my being a citizen here in the United States, I would urge all people who are listening to this program, and I do this on all programs, that we have a moral responsibility to stand up for basic human decency. And we have a legal responsibility to pull back the country of the United States, of which we are citizens, from its rogue nation position, standing outside of the protocols of nations, and which nations have established since 1947, the frameworks in which they would take up both their mutual interests and their ideological and political differences respectfully and with peace. I think we should be mindful that it was not Obama who, quote unquote, opened Cuba. It was a discussion and a negotiation between the presidency of Barack Obama and the presidency of Raul Castro, which has been documented that Raul Castro was deeply involved every step of the way with the Cuban delegation and reaching that accord for full diplomatic relations. So the bottom line is, yes, we should stand against this economic warfare called legislatively the embargo in the United States Congress. And that's a very important designation because that is the way that it's going to be unraveled. It will not be unraveled with the term blockade. But we must also understand and respect the position of the Cubans because it is a blockade against them. But our work here is to dismantle this legislative embargo. In that context, I'm mindful, as I always am, and I think all of you are, of Amilcar Cabral's, in which we tend to reduce his very significant quote, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories," which starts off by hide nothing from the masses of our people. Do not obscure any mistakes, difficulties, or errors. And here I think we have to then take the vantage point, plural, involving inside of Cuba since the Cuban Revolution, which involves 3 or 4 basic sectors of Cuban citizens. They're Cuban patriots who are nationalists, who want to deal with their own virtues, their own strengths, their own errors, their own failures. They're not members of the Communist Party. They do not identify themselves as socialists. They're the majority of the population. They have a range of self-identifiers from being of Spanish descent. That has a legal implication. When you can document that, you can also have citizenship in Spain. Some of them refer to themselves as mestizos or mulattos. Some of them refer to themselves as prietos or blacks. Some of them refer to themselves as Afro-Cubans. I don't think I've ever come in contact with a Cuban who says, I'm African. That is not a rejection of Africa because they do embrace Africa. And so I think we need to take the vantage point of the Cubans and be very meticulous about bringing our own external vantage points of what reality is, because those realities, the most important realities are those expressed by Cubans. Now, on the question of race, Fidel Castro, one of his most notable quotes is he says, I think the most difficult task of the Cuban Revolution will be addressing the issue of race. He was very clear about that, and it's turned out to be the case. The Communist Party of Cuba, for many decades, took a position that because they had eradicated the formal discrimination policies of who could go to what beach, who could walk on what side of what park, so forth and so on, that they had eradicated racism. Well, the blunt reality emerged that they had not eradicated racism. So these are not legacy questions. These are contemporary reproductive questions. Now, the Cuban Revolution's official line in this century is that racism is a cultural question. They had the anthropology department about 15 years ago to do research on Cuban households. And they say the reproduction of personal prejudices about people's hair, the size of their nose, their lips, and other kind of derogatory things that we are aware throughout this hemisphere are being said about Black people was simply a cultural question. I posed the question that if that, and they said it was pervasive and it reproduces. If it's pervasive and it reproduces in households, then what about the public space, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, in workplaces? That's a systemic question. And I think we have to come, now the Cuban Communist Party is coming around to do its own self-critique that racism has not been eradicated. I'm a socialist. I've been a longstanding public Marxist-Leninist socialist, even in my public work. And of course, one of the basic lines of Marxism is that racism is simply organic to capitalism and will only be eradicated under socialism. Well, racism is not eradicated under the Cuban system, notwithstanding great gains that the Cuban Revolution has made for all of its citizens. And one of the clear examples of that in this right now in 2021 is that 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, the current president of Cuba, Díaz-Canel Bermúdez, established a presidential commission, their terms, against racism and discrimination. Now, you have many Black Cubans that I know very well. Some of you know some of them, who I think are what I would call cultural nationalists. I don't say that as a put down. I say it as a description of what they think about. They're interested in the excavation of African history. They complain and critique about issues of racism, but they are not directly engaged in negotiation with their stewards, their elected officials, on how are they going to address and resolve this problem. So there is a significant distance in many instances between the Presidential Commission and these community-based civic organizations, Club Espendru and others, who emerge critiquing the issues of racism. We need to be aware of that. That's not a put down of the Cuban Revolution. One of the problems of progressives and certainly of leftists about the Cuban Revolution is that we held the Cuban Revolution up as gods. And the Cubans finally had to say, we are not gods. We are as fragile as any other group of people. But what has distinguished the Cuban Revolution is its willful commitment to justice and humanity, which is expressed in its healthcare system and its educational system. But if you go to Cuban jails, you will find the same thing that you find in Brazil and Colombia and Chicago. It will be highly racialized. And those are not legacy questions, those are contemporary questions. And we have to face that if we're interested in the construction of a just socialism, and Cubans are interested in that question. That is why there is a presidential commission that has come around to say, we have a knotty problem here. In 1988, I wrote an article I refer to you called Reflections on Race in Cuba. My arm was sort of twisted by Manning Marable to come down to Cuba with him. It was his first trip, first time I met Michael Eric Dyson, who was also on that trip. And I talked about an interview that I had with Juan Almeida, a member of the Cuban then intersection some years earlier, had invited me to come to Cuba along with Sylvia Hill and with Bill Strickland out of Massachusetts, who's known for his work around the Institute of the Black World, the previous Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, Georgia, with Vincent Harding. And Juan Almeida and I got in a debate. He says there's no such thing as a Black Cuban. As a very dark-skinned Cuban from the member of the Communist Party on the America desk was seated next to us doing the translation. And he got so frustrated with me after about 3 hours, he finally turned and says, well, you should take her. A contradiction. He looked like my father. He sort of my color, brown skin color, but she was jet black, as we say in the African-American community. So there are contradictions that we should not mask. There are difficulties that we should not hide. There are errors that have been made. There are failures that have been made. That when Raul Castro was elected by the National Assembly, he was not put into the presidency because he was Fidel Castro's brother. He was put into the presidency because he ran the most effective institution in Cuba, the military, that he had great skills to do that. One of the very first things that Raul Castro said publicly, there is too little criticism in Cuba. We need more criticism. What he meant by that is within the revolution, everything, outside of the revolution, nothing. If you have a criticism, raise it. If you have a proposal, raise it. And he said to the Communist Party, you are indispensable to the security and the direction of this country, but you are not the government. He was trying to rebalance this issue of centralism between the Communist Party, the government, and the most important issue in democracy. And democracy is not equal to capitalism, and it's not equal to socialism. It is about the demos, the ordinary citizen, the kwasha, the power of the ordinary citizen, and about their stewards of government, not about a party, not about an individual figure, because they are the sons and daughters of everyday people. And that is, so deepening socialist democracy is on the agenda, and race is central to that question. And I think we have to take the vantage point of the Cubans. I read Grandma every day, so I'm not just trying to put forth James Early's perspectives on this. I'm trying to understand what are the dynamics, the debates about their unity and their achievements of all Cubans. And in that context, what are their critiques and criticisms and proposals for repairing and deepening their revolution? And there is much discussion going on, because if we mask these difficulties, if we mask these errors, if we mask these failures, rest assured, our enemy will not. So under the George Bush administration and the so-called Freedom of Democracy Act for Cuba, there were 2 pages in there and where they say, target the issue of racism in Cuba because the Cubans don't want to deal with it headlong. And therefore the Las Damas en Blanca, the ladies in white, they're significantly Black. They're not exclusively Black. In the protests that we saw recently, you see a lot of Black people and a lot of Black rappers. Now, what they share in common with all Cubans is that Cubans are having the worst economic situation since the fall of the Soviet Union. That is compounded by the pandemic, but most significantly, it is through this economic warfare called the legislative embargo on this side and the blockade on the Cuban side. But President Diaz-Canel has said, we must look, as Raul Castro said when he was president, that this embargo, this blockade is killing them. But if it were to be removed tomorrow, the question of whether the revolution would survive depends on how they deal with their own errors and their own failures. And so to conclude my comments here, the refreshing thing is that you've got a government who is openly talking about not just its strengths, not just talking about its absolute life-defining necessity to fight US imperialism, US capitalism, but talking about, let us look into the mirror, not just recognize our strengths, but see where we may have made errors, where we may have made failures, and let's figure out how to address them. Because he recognizes if they don't, their opposition will. And this is one of the reasons that you were seeing these expressions on the part of a number of Black Cubans. So I would urge us to look inside and listen to the Cubans of how they handle their strengths, and in that context, how they handle their own errors and debate. And of course, we stand foursquare with them against a US imperial intervention. Leave it up to their sovereignty, their independence, their self-determination. They have shown that they're an extraordinary people over the last 62 years, that they can figure their way in this world of 8 billion people, notwithstanding the fact that they are only 11 million. They are a blessing to the entire planet, as we have seen. It was Fidel Castro who was talking about debt long before any of these countries wanted to talk about it. It was Fidel Castro who was talking about climate change long before any of these people were talking about it. But Fidel Castro did not build the Cuban medical system. He called for it and he provided a basis for people to be educated, and Cubans built that. And that is why Cuba is the only socialist country, well, it's not quite true. Cuba, in the context of the Americas, has had 3 transitions in the head of government with hardly a ripple that goes on, because they have drawn on the strengths of all of their people. But the struggle against racism is a transversal question. It is an indispensable question for the advancement of not only of this revolution, but of any revolution. And if we walk sideways on that question, the Cubans don't need us to defend their revolution. They can do that quite well. But they do need us to help amplify and to spread the truth of their own internal dialogues about how they are managing to take forward their revolution. So I would urge us to consider that.
Thank you very much, my brother. I just love how this is going. We're getting, you know, it's so expressive, and it's more than I could wish for. I'm so happy that we're doing so well with this in this discussion. You know, we just have about 25 minutes left, and so I'm gonna turn to get a view from you know, Brother Bamboshi on what we've discussed. If you want to add something else, or if you have any other comments, we're gonna you can do that right now. Just be mindful that, we are on a time constraint here. and then I'll go next to Obi, and then I'll go to Sister Esther. All right. Pamboshi, you're muted.
Thank you.
Mhm.
It is interesting that I think this is what you're doing is exactly what Fidel called for. He called for the struggle over ideas. I think that is taking place the length and breadth of Cuba today. And the question of race is a special part of that struggle. And that has taken place also. And I think that has taken place not in opposition to the Cuban government or the Cuban society or socialism or communism. It has taken place within the context of those economic systems, which is a good thing. I think that there are people who made it possible for this struggle to emerge. Going back, Cuba has always been squeezed by the United States when the United States thought that Cuba was in a crisis. Most of the laws that exist today that Trump is using and now Biden is laws that were created during the special period. They had the laws to trading with the enemy, etc. But the specifics of these laws, the question of if a ship visit Cuba with goods and drop it off, it cannot visit any ports inside the United States for 6 months. That law came into being during the special period. So the US have taken this opportunity. They have now expanded this opportunity. As our sister said, during all of this, they've used every tool at their disposal to try to do regime change in Cuba. Also in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in other places. And the one thing that Cuba has that most of these other countries unfortunately did not have is that when the Cuban Revolution gained victory in 1959, most of the reactionaries in Cuba fled Cuba. And I was in Jamaica. I know they came to Jamaica first, but they were only there for about 2 weeks. Then they ended up in Miami. Not only did they flee to Miami, but the United States government took the opportunity to kidnap their children. An operation called Operation Pedro Pan or Peter Pan, in which they kidnapped children of the wealthy who were living in Cuba and brought them to Miami. So therefore, inside of Cuba, there was no organized, fermented opposition as there are in Venezuela today. And again, that's a good thing. But the US have tried to create this opposition. And one of the ways they've tried to create it is by financing the question of racism and the question of sexism. The struggle over these questions are raging throughout the island. And it will not end today, tomorrow, or in the near future. But the demonstrations that occurred last Sunday were not a result of the organizing efforts of populations inside of Cuba who were in opposition to the government or the country. Most of the folks in the demonstration were hungry. I talk to folks in Cuba almost every day. They will tell you, we don't have no food. The lines for food is too long. That is not a result of the organizing aspects of the Cuban government, because they have tried to create food sustainability. It is the effort of the money that's being poured out of NED, out of USAID, and out of the gusanos in Florida and New Jersey. And as we begin to look at this, and we begin to see what's happening, when Canal said the revolutionary must take back their streets, you saw who the Cuban people supported. And in going to Cuba, anybody who went to Cuba will know there's no fear on the part of Cuban people to speak their mind. They do it even without being asked. There's no fear on the part of the people to say what they think is wrong. But this does not translate into, we now want to overthrow our government. I mean, we'll tell you a whole bunch of stuff that's wrong inside the United States. So here we see the struggle over ideas coming into being. The struggle over ideas that's taken precedence in terms of what's happening in the island. I think that secondly, on the question of Obama was forced into making the decisions he made in 2016. And this push for him to make these decisions started in 2000, when inside of Venezuela, a brother by the name of Hugo Chavez was elected president, followed by Eva, followed by Lulu, so that by the time Obama went to the Conference of Latin American States, everybody was in opposition to the US position on Cuba. They had to make a change. They had to make a change. So this change they made was a tactical change. Obama said it. He said that over 60 years, what we have done has not worked. Therefore, we have to change our tactic. We have to show the Cuban people that by flooding them with people from the United States, they will see our values and our richness, and they will want to be like us. And thus, they will do what the embargo should have done: overthrow the Cuban government, create regime change. That's not happening. That's not happening. The majority of people in Cuba today, I can probably say, was born either right at or right after the Cuban Revolution. And as such, what they're looking at is not the situation that existed in Cuba before the revolution, where the wealthy had health and education and everybody else didn't. But what they're also seeing is that they're being squeezed and they have to figure out how to survive as a people. And that's what they're doing. The Cubans who are sitting on the border in Mexico, trying to get into the US, They're not coming because they're in opposition to the Cuban government. They're coming because they want to eat. I'll stop.
Thank you, Brother Bangladeshi. I will do a little switching. Sister Esther, I'll let you continue because I think that's right. Just after Baba Moshe, that's right, should be right in your area.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a few things that I tried to remember, some of the points that I didn't remember the first time I spoke. And I thought of these things as kind of points that we can make that we can relate to in terms of African American culture. So one of the things is that when the United States, assassinated the president, and when the Haitian president was assassinated in 1915, then the United States went into Cuba at that time and occupied it. They brought some of the same traditions of Jim Crow. So we understand what Jim Crow here is in the United States. We understand that system of really what I consider it a fascist system, really, So they brought that same system to Cuba. And so some of the same, the levels of discrimination, violence, murder, that same system existed in Cuba, the same segregation. And I think we talked about it earlier. James talked about segregation of beaches and all that sort of thing. And so when the revolution happened, those outward systems disappeared. There was no more, they eliminated that type of discrimination. And so that's one thing that I was thinking about, that the United States put that there. Cuba had its own legacy of racism and colonialism and all those horrible things we talked about before, enslavement and, the kind of leasing out of enslaved women as prostitutes. But that was one thing. And the other thing that I was thinking about is the fact that from going to Cuba, going to Brazil, it was really clear to me that unlike here, they never had a Black is Beautiful movement. So when I was in Brazil and I was in the more the Blacker parts like Bahia, and at that point, this was also in the late 90s, I guess, yeah, almost at the 2000 point. So gosh, it's 2 decades ago now. But they were having their Black is Beautiful movement. They had their first Black woman who was the carnival queen, the queen of their annual big celebration. It was the first time it was a dark woman, and that was a big deal. And so it reminded me, going to these different places in the diaspora, that we were able to have a Black is Beautiful movement. And this is when I was a child. So I only grew up having a sense of being proud of being Black. I definitely knew that, there was still this thing where at some point, to be called Black, it was an insult, but it was very quickly changed, but in Cuba, they didn't have that. So when I was on the work brigade out at one of the camps outside of Havana, there was this mural behind the stage where people would kind of gather for community celebrations. And this is mural of this person with these huge lips, not in a complimentary way, but it was what we would call a Sambo image. And so between that and then going into Havana and seeing in some of the tourist markets, I would see what I considered to be really racist art pieces. There was this one of a Black woman with her, a beggar, and her clothes were raggedy and her breast was exposed. And she's has her hand out like this. And this is kind of this, I don't know, it seems like a really iconic thing there, because I kept seeing this image. And it was a very debased image of Black people. And I remember saying something about it in one of the meetings and just talking about giving my reaction to it. And I think I was confronted with some of the attitudes and some of the discussions that James was talking about, where you have a lot of people who don't really want to recognize that these types of things are really elements of racism, and or naive to recognizing that racism exists. But I'm glad he mentioned the commission, the presidential commission, because before the pandemic, I was invited to come to a special program put on by the House of the Americas in Havana. And so I wanted to read a little bit from that, because this was, I think, is really rich in terms of what they were trying to accomplish in this one meeting in relationship to this commission from the president. So the most transcendent anti-colonial battle of the peoples of Afro-America takes place in the field of culture, because the system of capitalist domination has operated for 500 years to codify in 1,000 ways our subaltern condition. Committed to the final emancipation of our peoples, the House of the Americas, Havana, Cuba, convenes the first international workshop, African American Diversity, Educational, Cultural, and Communication Strategies for the Anti-Colonial Fight, whose sessions will be or take place June 16 to 19, 2020. And I assume that this was canceled. This was like the height of the pandemic, and everything I read said that Cuba was closed. So I didn't think it happened, though I saw the friend who had invited me down, maybe, I don't know. I don't think it happened. But anyway, this participatory activity brings together teachers, cultural promoters, neighborhood leaders, and social and academic communicators to develop intercultural workshops, samples and presentations of books, projection of audio visuals, exhibition of posters, and professional meetings. The first workshop aims to socialize practical experiences developed in different territories of African America, from Canada to Chile, to combat epistemic racisms and discrimination of all kinds. In compliance with this objective, methods, ways, and forms of struggle against colonial inheritances associated with skin colors, genders, cultural affiliations, languages, and territorial origin, among other axes of confrontation with capitalism in its strategies of domination, will be examined. And just a few things. It says the training activities of this workshop will take into account the following topics: rewriting and rereading of the universal and African American stories, language and language as territories of domination and reproduction of colonial culture, the inferiorization and invisibility of Blackness in school texts and fiction literature in African America, literature and art in the face of racism and discrimination. Clear skins are preferred. And I love that, because, we use that term here when they say clear, and they mean like light skin, right? Clear skins are preferred. Challenge Indo-racism, internalized racism, and colorism. Smooth, curly Afro ? Racial awareness and contradictions of Afro aesthetics. Women halfway. Conquests, advances, and challenges of American Afrofeminism. The modern colonial imaginary imagination in the film industry. The Afro descendants in the architecture and monumental art of our America. Activism, self-care, and sustainability. Citizen initiatives and community ventures. Means and strategies to ensure the sustainability of speeches against hegemonics in the 21st century. And the last one there is in the alliance of strength, good practices for networking in the anti-racist struggle. So that's really, I love that as a document that I'll always keep and cherish. And I assume that after the pandemic, the conference will go on. And so it also, that last point is kind of a good way of segueing in terms of what the UNIA is doing. I mean, that would be a good conference or, thing for the UNIA to participate in as a way of kind of connecting with Black people in Cuba and the kind of conversations that they're having. And the last thing I'll say is to remind everybody about the rally Sunday, 2 p.m. at the White House, to support the people who have walked all the way from Miami to DC to call for an end to the embargo. They like to paint the Miami or Cuban Americans as this monolithic bloc that is always against Cuba. There are Cubans in the United States who support Cuba as a sovereign place that deserves its sovereignty without interference from the United States. So that is something that also that the UNIA can connect with, and connect with all the peace community that is supporting Cuba. That's it.
Very good. Very good, my sister. Thank you very much for that. Again, you know, I'm feeling quite proud that this we were able to bring this off tonight. Because, oh, and I might say as well that just let me know when this thing is happening. That conference you just mentioned, because I certainly would like to be a part of that. Okay, I will now switch to Brother Obi to be the last word, or to, so you have the floor.
Okay, I wanted to thank Congo for mentioning Arnaldo Mendez. He mentioned, he didn't say his name, but Arnaldo Mendez is the African who's the face of the Cuban space program. So, it was no way that we could leave this meeting based on the sentiment, based on the track record and pedigree of people here, and not mention Comandante Salvador Mesa, who is an African who's the first vice president of Cuba right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he has a track record that goes back decades. And that's not, and when you bring these type of things up, when you bring up Nicolas Guillen being the face of the revolution culturally, when you bring up the fact they have an African vice president right now, detractors will say that these are ceremonious positions to divert attention away from the questions they're raising, not giving them credit for organically coming full circle on these particular questions. At the root of our solidarity must be humility. We strongly urge against anyone going there, especially those who are African like us, who have a paternalistic disposition when they engage the Cubans on these sensitive questions, necessary questions. So the way to look at that is, what are the practical things that can be done? When we did the children's play, a conversation began that the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company could emerge as having the first children to children's link with La Comunita, the Cuban National Theatrical Ensemble, which is something that we are still pursuing. Bamboshi remembers in 2003, we convinced the Cuban diplomats in Washington, D.C. to celebrate African Liberation Day as a way to engage, and they celebrated in Cuba. And James knows in Cuba, they still celebrate it as African Liberation Day, not the neo-colonialist makeover that the African Union has imposed on us, where they call it Africa Day, removing liberation from the equation. Cuba still calls it African Liberation Day. So these are, and I will repeat what I said earlier, the way to build these ties at the people-to-people level is to recognize when our language and our activity complements each other's. I cannot understand, I've been in conversations with the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, in COBRA, the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa for the last 4 days, asking them, when you heard Cuba come on record and say that they are pursuing reparations for the blockade, using that language to show solidarity, why have you not connected that to your efforts in the United States? Brother Stamp brought up, Brother Congo brought up CARICOM. Yes, Cuba should have more than observer status, but even more important than that, in the last couple of days, the foreign minister of Barbados and the prime minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Gonsalves, has come out in defense of Cuba, which was anticipated. But the one thing that we have to let them know, and we've been talking to grassroots organizations in the Caribbean all week long, how did you let them have a lawsuit dealing with reparations, and they know that Cuba said they were seeking reparations for the blockade damages, which automatically modernizes and evolves the question for reparations? Why would they separate the two? So in this appeal we are making, we are asking CARICOM to now say that they're going to make the fight for Cuba to have restitution, repair, and redemption for the losses. And according to Ambassador Pedrosa Cuesta and the foreign minister of Cuba, we're talking in the neighborhood of $150 billion. And we are asking every foundation of every former president to contribute to that based on their ability to shake down corporations for dollars so that they can parade around as born-again humanitarians. We feel that this is timely because what this enables us to do is we're speaking we have the honor of addressing the Panafest Festival in Ghana on Tuesday. And we know many Africans that are going to Ghana, like gamblers go to Atlantic City and Las Vegas. We're letting all of them know every time you go to Ghana moving forward, you must have medical supplies for the Cuban medical personnel in Ghana. The countries we're targeting to begin in September are Ghana, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, South Africa, Liberia, and Guinea. Those are the 7 that we're starting with. Where you have, and what that also does is at an organizational level, see, we are tired of the bastardization of methodology. So when we talk about intensifying the discussion on ideas, that does not make you devoid or exempt from coming to put this stuff in practice. What this enables us to do is to engage the African student unions at HBCUs and white campuses, which Osaje for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah started, by the way. And we can say to them, the time has come for them to go into the civic associations in the communities, the Ethiopian Civics Association, the Nigerian Civic Association, and say to them, this is a humanitarian effort. And it breaks the stranglehold that the United States Agency for International Development has on Africa. And ironically, it was 7 years ago, before President Obama took his high-profile field trip to Cuba, because that's all it was. What happened was the United States Agency for International Development was busted in Cuba, at an HIV/AIDS conference, urging people to rise up against their government. What you saw a week and a half ago, well, 2 weeks ago now, that had been planned since 2003. Because when Jimmy Carter went to Cuba, he negotiated something that had been pushed since in the late 90s called the Valera Project, which meant that the inevitable would take place, that the carryover from the Cuban American National Foundation, terrorist organizations like Brothers to the Rescue and Alpha 66, they would start to establish themselves on the ground in Cuba. So if 635 assassination attempts did not work on Comandante Fidel, if blowing up hotels didn't work, blowing up an airplane, killing Olympic athletes did not work, using the movie Scarface to vilify Cuba, which resulted in the escalation of the distribution of crack cocaine in our communities. Because when we talk to our homies in the hood about Cuba, we use the movie Scarface. And the conversation changes because they had no idea what the original intent of that movie was. The same way when we watch Godfather and talk about Cuba. So I'm just saying that what has happened is we have come up with some very effective strategies. And for those of you who watched the cultural tributes we did, most of the artists were African, whether they were playing salsa, whether they were playing jazz, whether they were playing the steel drums like we do in Trinidad, whether they were performing reggae, and all these different genres of music that Cuba has embraced. So in the spirit of working with them and engaging them, we're just concerned about the paternalistic disposition that people have. And as someone who works in the United States, to be honest with you, I'm more worried about the racism and paternalism in Cuban solidarity circles that Africans that do Cuba work get subjected to every now and then. So, I mean, but trust me, we navigate around it though. You can't stop us from doing Cuban work. But at the same time, these are things that happen all the time, but we are confident and optimistic that the projects that we do in Africa, the projects that we do in conjunction with our sisters and brothers in the Caribbean, the projects that we do in the United States, because remember, what this does is it gives a different lens to the microscope. The quote unquote Cuban Solidarity Network in this country is under more spotlight than it's ever been, because conventional wisdom says if 184 countries for the 29th year in a row have called for this policy to be eradicated, what is going on with the people who are supposed to be in solidarity with them in the United States? What are the weaknesses of that movement? What are the contradictions of that movement? Where are the points of stagnation in that movement? So what I'm happy about is this is challenging us to
You lost your sound.
Sound. No sound.
organization. And he wanted to know of an issue or an activity that he could propose to them to spice things up a little bit. And I said, brother, I think they can come out against the blockade on Cuba. And last Wednesday night, the whole world saw Black Lives Matter come out against the blockade on Cuba because of a 30-year-old in South Bend, Indiana, named Jordan Geiger. We swore him to secrecy that he wouldn't say we had something to do with it. But in the spirit of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee getting Dr. King to come out against Vietnam, we thought that this was a good time to deal with these different things. The decision we made to the fact that Zimbabwe made me the external relations officer, my assignment is one, to build ties with Africans throughout the diaspora on the question of Cuba. And through that, we look at different cultural things. The pushing hip hop artists is a response to what we did, where we produced 3 albums of music. They watch what we do and they try to duplicate it so that they're effective. But the work we're doing in the arts, the work we're doing in media, the work we're doing in education, it picks up every day. So when we have these type of conversations, we must make sure that the methodology is not phased out, because what this gives us a chance to do is bridge the gap between our labor on a cross-generational level, on a demographical level, and what have you. Because and this is very important, because what happens in this Cuban solidarity work as well is not just gender dynamics and racial dynamics, but I'm gonna say this politely, numerical dynamics, age dynamics, where people old enough to be your parents talk to you like they're your children, but you're able to overcome it because you can show that your work is an expansion of their work and they cannot deny it. So these are the things we struggle around. So if the struggle to, and we don't consider what Cuba is dealing with racism. That's on the surface. It's part of the decolonization process that Africans are going through in the Western Hemisphere. And because of their revolutionary pedigree, they're very central to it. And the other thing we are cautious about is people looking for these contradictions as an excuse to not embrace service. I remember hearing people say when Obama was planning his high-profile field trip there, oh, they're going to give back Asada. No, you want them to give back Asada so you can use that as an excuse to say you were right the whole time for sitting on the sidelines. They're going to pull all their medical brigades off the African continent. They're not going to do that. That gives you an excuse not to explore creative ways to support that work on the African continent, since you love Africa so much. And so that's I felt that was a good way to conclude. So once again, safeguarding against the paternalistic approach to engagement, and exploring innovative methods of engagement on a practical level that satisfies what they're doing in pursuit of their objectives and what we are doing in pursuit of our objectives, since we are one people and one struggle when it's all said and done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brother Obi. You know, I can't say how much I appreciate this panel and how well it went, the information shared, the outlook on how we look at Africans, not just in the US, but in Cuba. You know, our experiences when we get there, and I mean, Sister Hester, she mentioned it. It's yes. I mean, you know, when we go there, we see Africans, and I'm saying Africans because that is how we, you know, express ourselves for Black people everywhere. And we may expect them to think that because they're African descendants, it's acceptable to call them Africans or Black, and they're going through what we went through here, because that sort of thing happened here. And you're right, Brother Obi. You know, it's a process, and we hope that you know, it's going to get to that point where we wouldn't even have to discuss it. I thank you very much, Brother Bamboshe, Sister Esther, Brother James, Brother Obi. It's been a pleasure. And I hope if I call on you again, you wouldn't say, no, your forums go too long, and you know. I just hope I can have you back again.
Anytime,
right.
man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure and honor to participate.
We can never reject a platform that represents the house that the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey built. That would be sinful.
I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
sir. We thank you.
All right.
Take care. Very good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm wait a minute. Anyway, that's it, folks. And we're just playing a part of this anthem. I hope you can hear it clearly.
I gotta go.
All right. Peace. Bye-bye.
Peace. All right.
All right.